Emily Timothy is a physiotherapist who works with the Community Stroke Rehabilitation Service in Christchurch. So it's through this role that she became interested in the embodied experience of stroke, which sparked her research journey. So she completed her research project as part of a Masters in Health Science with the University of Otago at the Rehabilitation Teaching and Research Unit. Completed that in 2015. And so currently she is busy mastering the art of being a mum, which is very exciting, but hopes to continue her research journey in some shape or form in the future. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Debbie. And hello everyone, thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all out. And some of you may well have heard glimpses of this topic already. Hopefully it will be new and interesting to everybody. So as Debbie mentioned, I start this journey in my role as physio in the Community Stroke Service. And I noticed this was a time when people seemed to reflect on what it meant to them to have had a stroke. So I met people soon after leaving hospital having had a stroke. And people seemed to connect differently to their bodies. And it got me thinking, what does it mean for us as physiotherapists, who the body is essentially our core business? I couldn't help but think that although, like many of you, I believe that I was a person-centered physio, reflective in my practice, couldn't help but think that somehow I still had my blinkers on when it came to the body and physiotherapy. Now today I am coming from my perspective as a physio and focusing on stroke, but I do believe that this should be of interest to other areas and hopefully we'll all take something from it. That would be really interesting at the end to be able to hear how this resonates with you and your practice. So, I'm going to talk about what does this word embodiment mean, why it's important, what we already know about the topic, then moving on to my study, and perhaps most importantly, the so what. Now, there are a number of definitions of embodiment and a lack of common language between professions, which of course makes it confusing. I've been using Merleau-Ponty's definition, which is how we live in and experience the world through our bodies. So it's really acknowledging that our bodies are not just a thing, an object, but it's the way that we fulfill our desires, it's the way others see us, and it's the way that we connect and experience the world around us. So how does this word embodiment fit in with our health models? As I'm sure you're all aware, much of healthcare has evolved from the biomedical model. And in this model, there is an assumption of normality and abnormality. And often within this model, the body's viewed as a machine. Of course, our models and theories have evolved since this time, and increasingly we're looking at a more whole view of our bodies and of health. And we have models such as biocycles, social approach, holism, person-centered care, and of course the ICF, which all add to our understanding of healthcare. I would argue though that all these models still lack that true understanding of that embodied experience. And often these models look at health from an external perspective, how we as health professionals consider somebody's health condition to be affecting them, and lack that lived experience of health. So I'd just like to talk a bit about some of the literature that is out there already about the embodied experience, and I'm focusing on stroke here. So there are few, but certainly some really great studies out there, and some commonalities across these studies. So there's been a variety of stages of stroke recovery that have been looked at, different ages, gender differences, some focusing on specific impairments such as ataxia after stroke. But across the studies there's common themes that come up. Firstly, the body as being foreign. So within this, people describing how their body can be unreliable, demanding to them, and profoundly different to themselves. In some studies, people spoke of an extended body, so a way that their splints or pieces of equipment that they're using have become part of their body. Along with this theme was a disrupted sense of self, so a body that's not me, and feeling alienated and with this feeling different about themselves in a variety of situations. And this leads me on to the final common theme of creating coherence. So many of the studies talked about the journey that people were going on after having had a stroke, and this distinct fundamental change with a biographical disruption in their lives of before stroke and after stroke. And as they were moving forwards, the sense of testing their bodies and reconnecting and learning anew of what they were embodying to them. Of course, these studies all give us some really valuable information, but I felt that there was something lacking. So for me, there was still no established theoretical models. They were common ideas, but no models underlining embodiment in stroke. And there were a few studies that specifically focused on embodiment in transition from hospital, which is when I get to meet people, so I'm particularly interested in this phase. As I've alluded to already, the notion of embodiment is poorly defined, especially in physiotherapy, which seems worrying given that the bodies are central to our practice. And perhaps most importantly, a lack of understanding of the implications of embodiment and what this means to us and also the people that we meet. So I'm not pretending that I managed to address all those things. I focused on one area to explore the embodied experience of stroke for people 1 month after hospital-based rehabilitation. So specifically exploring the experience that people had living with a changed body when transitioning from hospital. And I especially wanted to improve the understanding of the embodied experience of life after stroke, especially for physiotherapists, but also for other clinicians. I used a grounded theory model, grounded theory method I should say, and I believe you may well have had a workshop recently, so I'm hoping you're all experts on the topic. So I interviewed a total of 7 people. I initially started off with purposeful sampling, so all I asked was that people identified having a changed physical body and were able to participate in an interview. And as my interviews and coding went on, I then used theoretical sampling. So I selected people based on the theories that were evolving and how I wanted to test my theories. So I met people in hospital and recruited them, and then I spoke with them on the phone on 3 consecutive weeks of them returning home. The purpose of this phone call was to help build a rapport with the people so that I was able to connect with them and then go into quite depthful and quite philosophical conversations with them. And it also allowed me to capture that first bit of rawness, I guess, of when people first go home of what they were feeling like at that stage. And so then at 1 month I went and met people, everyone actually chose to be interviewed in their own homes. The people I interviewed had a variety of stroke types and severity, but all of them were able to speak with me about their experience of a changed body. And with grounded theory, I coded and did forward and backward analysis using memos, diagramming to help me develop a theoretical model. I adopted Shamaz's approach to grounded theory, which you may have talked about if you went to the workshop, which is really underpinned by the assumption that researcher and participants co-create meaning. So all the way through my methodology, I was being transparent about how I was contributing and how participants were contributing to create this understanding. And this is what we came up with. So the embodied experience of stroke appeared to be, on the one hand, a sense of divergence in one's body and self, of this body and me, and then on the other hand, a sense of cohesion in one's body self, so it's all me. Although these ideas seem conceptually opposing, they weren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So people could speak about being just the same as they always were, but yet totally different within one sentence, but also over time. Similarly, they weren't necessarily polar emotionally. Generally, people seemed more comfortable when they were talking about this cohesion in between their body and themselves, but people could also feel comfortable when there was divergence between their body and themselves. So what influenced where people sat on this continuum? Well, I identified some anchors that seemed to enable people to be more comfortable in the experience that they were having. I'm going to explain these things in a little bit more detail and give you some examples. So firstly, this divergent body self, a sense of one's body being profoundly different to one's self-identity. People spoke of a body that was strange, unpredictable, and effortful to move. So all the examples I should just point out, I've used pseudonyms. This is Peter talking about his leg. It won't do what you want it to do most times, you know? You want it to. It's a strange feeling to have it not connecting with your brain. And you take it as, when you're normal, you don't think anything about it. When you're wanting to try and do something that won't let you do it, it's the strangest feeling in the world. So Peter's very explicit about how strange his leg feels to him, but notice also how he consistently refers to his leg as an it, an object. Peter also went on to talk about the effort it was just to do everyday tasks because his body felt so strange and different to him. Here's another example. This is Helena talking about her arm. My arm is, I can still feel it. I can feel it. But it's gone unpredictable. It isn't doing this so much. It was knocking the food off my plate or some of it. And yesterday, what did it do? Something unpredictable. And again, notice how Helena objectifies her arm and almost gives it an identity of its own, as though her arm is some unruly child that she has no control over. At other times, though, people spoke of this wholeness, this cohesion in their body itself. And at these times, people spoke of freedom, of control, and of this overarching sense of identity. And this is George talking about the time that he walked in hospital. That time I really found it most was that time I was telling you, when the lady said, for God's sake, just walk. That was freedom. It really was. I can still recollect what it was like, you know? Nothing there. I didn't have to hang on to anything. Now, this moment was really vivid for George. He kept on coming back to it repeatedly during my interview with him. And he explained to me how it reminded him of his boyhood days, of that freedom of movement. And this is Helena again. I asked her to tell me what it made her thought when her arm was unpredictable. Well, that it makes you wonder if it's coming back, if it will come back. It makes you initially feel as if you're losing control of yourself completely. I asked her to name more. Well, yes, that it's a big shake-up, to feel that a part of you has, well, maybe died. That is very challenging. So here's a perhaps less positive emotionally example of that cohesion, where Helena's lack of control of her body had overflowed into her lack of control over her life completely. And although Helena's almost grieving for that loss, she consistently talked about that overarching sense of identity of, despite everything being different, she still felt the same. So it's that kind of contradiction that people would frequently make in their conversations. Now moving on to these anchors that seem to help people to fit more comfortably in whatever experience they were having. The firstly, a sense of knowledge, and often that was intrinsic knowledge, so knowledge about one's own body, a person's attitude, and then their environment around them, both social, physical. This is grace. Suddenly, you're devoid of being able to use your hand, get up and walk, do your own thing. Your freedom's all gone. But I remember there was one sister in particular who was wonderful to me. And I sort of longed for her to be on duty because she would talk to me about the future and ask me what I wanted to do. And you know, opened a new avenue for me. Now Grace was perhaps one of the most affected people that I interviewed. She was in a hospital facility and needed assistance with all daily activities. And whenever I asked Grace jokes about her bodily experience, she would almost instantly change the subject into hope. And she had a really strong sense of faith, and that seemed to be a really, really huge resource for her. This is Michael. Right, you get around the hospital a certain way, you know, walking and things like that, and in a wheelchair. You get home and it was a struggle to get up the steps, a struggle to walk in the passage, even with the walking stick, everything like that. So here's an example of how the physical environment around Michael, and perhaps the social environment, was changing how he experienced his body. So he learned to master his body and understood it when he was in hospital, but when he went home it was like learning anew. And so Michael spoke about that remastery of his body and did go on to feel comfortable in a range of environments, but that intrinsic knowledge helped him to feel comfortable again with his body. So what? I hear you're all thinking. Well, firstly, the bodily experience of stroke is altered to the extent that people can question their identity, lose hope for their future, and control over their lives. Now, I'm not just saying stroke alters those things. I believe that a change in one's body can alter these things. Context influences the embodied experience, and this was often in the seemingly small incidental ways. So it wasn't the big psychological session that people had, or maybe a discussion with the occupational therapist about returning home. It was the small incidental things, the nurse just passing by and having a conversation with someone. They were the things that seemed to really stand out to my participants. During the transition from hospital, the embodied experience is highly sensitive to influence. So this is a time when people might get the message, I'm crippled, or I'm still me. And finally, this, I believe, is practice evidence that the embodied experience should be integral to physiotherapy and stroke rehabilitation. This shows us that the meaning that people put on their body is important. Now, you might be thinking, well, we think about all these things already. That's great, but the problem is, if the embodied experience isn't acknowledged in our theoretical models or our professional practice competencies, how do undergraduates coming through know that it's expected of them as physiotherapists to be having these conversations of what it means to someone to have a change in their body? Similarly, in this climate of tightening resources and having to prove ourselves more and more, how can we justify spending an entire treatment session talking to somebody about what it means to them to have a changed body if it's not reflected in our professional practice models? I want to share with you some of the implications that my learning from undertaking the studies had on my practice. So firstly, I noticed and acknowledged the reflections people make on the impact of a changed body. So when somebody is talking about their arm as lame Larry, I ask them about it. I'm not there to give solutions, but I just open up the conversation. I convey hope of a positive future, irrespective of expected recovery, and I believe that that's possible to do it honestly. Sometimes it does mean talking about the elephant in the room, the what if I can't go home, what if I won't walk again. But those conversations are so important, and if it's not us having those conversations, then who is it? I promote people as experts in themselves, including their bodies. Yes, I've had experience with people who've had strokes, but I don't know what it feels like to have your body or anyone else's body for that matter. So I really try to facilitate people in recognising that they're a master in their own body and trying to help them to relearn how to connect with their own bodies. And then something that I've always wanted to do and hope that I've done and hope I continue to do is reflect on my approach, but always with the starting point being person first and the stroke second. acknowledging how our sense of personhood and identity is not just something to work towards and to give us hope and encouragement, but it's actually a source to help anchor us. So I have a few thoughts on next steps. Of course, every time you ask a question, more questions come from it. And these are certainly not new ideas. I'm sure you'll recognise that these are quite hot topics at the moment. And interestingly, that these things seem to be coming out of lots of different research areas and questions. So firstly, it seems that it's not just what we're doing as therapists, but it's how we're doing it. So looking more at how we can improve that way that we're delivering healthcare. And with that, active listening skills. I'm sure we all hope we have those, but there seems to be so many times that we can miss opportunities. And interesting for me, even the process of undertaking the interviews, where I almost had permission to spend as long as I wanted asking open questions with no agenda of my own, was amazing the information that I got from people. And though I like to think that I don't have an agenda when I speak with people, I've always got the back of my mind, oh, I've got to get through this and I've got to get through that. And so really learning about how can we balance up being effective and money efficient, but also really listening to people and understanding. Promoting wellness in health, not just addressing illness. So I guess that relates to things like looking at bigger goals, life goals, and how do we each fit into that picture along somebody's journey. And then skill sharing. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all go out there and become counsellors. That's not what this is about. But certainly, there's huge value in us being able to share one another's expertise without diluting our clinical skills. So how can we do that in a safe and effective way? I just want to go back to the original summation I did of the literature and just kind of point out where I feel my study has added to this literature. So firstly, this sense of fluxing, that it's not just that people experience these things in a kind of linear, progressive way and we're trying to help them onto the exit point. It's actually that people are fluxing between these experiences all the time. Sometimes less than others, but certainly it's a dynamic relationship. And the other thing I feel my study has added is these anchors, so the sense that there are things that we can influence, which is really exciting, and I guess that's where we come in. Now, this has been a little bit of a whistle stop, but if anyone is interested, I'm pleased to say that we have got this published in Physical Therapy Journal, so there's an early online version at the moment, so feel free if you want to look in more detail, you can find it there. And of course, there's people to be acknowledged. Firstly, the CDHB, who have supported me throughout my studies, and that includes also my peers who have helped with recruitment and also rallied me along during the journey. The University of Otago, who I completed this study with, and my supervisors, unfortunately, couldn't be here today, and also William in the back. And then, of course, my participants, who, without them, none of this would be possible. And I have to say, I was amazed at just how honest and open people were with me, and I felt really privileged that people were happy to share that with me. That's me done. Gives us plenty of time for discussion and questions.